The birth of Joseph. Genesis chapter 30 verse 22, 1916 BC, 166th year of the covenant of the torch. Isaac's age 150, Jacob's age 90. Rachel was able to give birth to Joseph wholly because God remembered her. Genesis chapter 30 verse 22 states, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb." Here, the Hebrew word for remembered, zachar, refers not to the mere act of remembering, but to a deep understanding and care. Genesis chapter 8 verse 1, 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 19. In Egypt, Joseph became second in command at the age of 30 and reunited with his father after the 7 years of abundance had passed, on the 3rd year of the famine. Since Joseph was 40 years old at this time and Jacob was 130 years old, we can deduce that Joseph was born to Jacob when he was 90 years old. Genesis chapter 45 verse 6. Rachel's womb, which had been closed for 7 years, miraculously opened when God remembered her. All it took was his remembrance. When God remembered Samuel's mother, Hannah, she gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 19. Then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord, and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 21. And the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew before the Lord. The precious blessing of God's remembrance awaits those who believe and wait until the end. Isaiah chapter 30 verse 18, Lamentations chapter 3 verse 25, Hebrews chapter 3 verse 14. Joseph was 16 years old when Jacob returned to Hebron and reunited with Isaac. This was not long after Joseph lost his mother, Rachel. After this, at the age of 17, Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt as a result of his brother's jealousy. Thus, he spent about 1 year with his grandfather Isaac. Joseph was probably greatly influenced by Isaac during this year. 1 year was a short period of time, but it was the precious time needed to inherit the covenant and deeply establish the root and foundation for his faith. 2 dreams that God gave to Joseph in the 13 years of trial. Genesis chapter 37, 39, 1899 BC, 183rd year of the covenant of the torch. Isaac's age 167, Jacob's age 107, Joseph's age 17. Jacob had Joseph through Rachel at the age of 90, 1916 BC, 166th year of the covenant. Joseph had 2 dreams at the age of 17, but his dreams were different from the dreams of other people. His dreams were revelations. In the first dream, 11 bound sheaves bow down to Joseph's sheaf. In the second dream, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bow down to Joseph. Genesis chapter 37 verse 6. The fact that he had 2 such dreams indicates that it was not a coincidence, but something that God plans and will fulfill. The Hebrew word for bowing, Genesis chapter 37 verse 7, that appears in the account of these 2 dreams is saha, a hishafel form of referring to the act of bowing voluntarily. A dream about receiving a bow is not ordinary. The act of bowing symbolizes complete admiration and submission. People tend to bow to the ones they consider greatly superior in personality, beliefs, and/or achievements. People bow to the rulers who reign wisely and bring inspiration to the nation. Also, the defeated bows to his conqueror. Joseph's dream meant that there would come a time when his brothers would voluntarily respect and obey him. It meant that Joseph was the firstborn among his brothers. Moreover, it foretold that he would become a world leader. All the Egyptians actually bowed down to him after he assumed the second-in-command position in Egypt. Genesis chapter 41 verse 45. His brothers bowed down to him when they came to Egypt to obtain food. Genesis chapter 42 verse 6. And people from all over the earth also came to buy food from Joseph because the famine was so severe. Genesis chapter 41 verse 54. Thus, one aspect of the dream was fulfilled. Furthermore, the dream was also foretelling how God's plan to move Jacob's family to Egypt in order to fulfill the covenant of the torch would be accomplished through Joseph. Joseph had monopolized his father's love and was hated by his brothers. Genesis chapter 37 verse 3. After the dream, he was almost killed by his brothers. Genesis chapter 37 verse 20. And experienced the adversity of being sold into Egypt. Genesis chapter 37 verse 12. Presumably, Benjamin was about 1 year old around this time. Joseph suffered the heartache of the early loss of his mother, but it must have caused him more pain to leave his infant brother behind. Isaac was 167 years old and still alive, and Jacob was 107 years old when Joseph was sold at the age of 17. Since Isaac lived until the age of 180, he shared the grief of Jacob over the loss of his son for 13 years. Isaac probably comforted Jacob, as he could see in these sorrows of Jacob the hand of God. Joseph's brothers sold him to the Midianite merchants, who then resold him in Egypt to Potiphar, who put Joseph in charge of his household. Genesis chapter 39, verse 1. When it had been about 10 years since Joseph was sold into Egypt, he was unjustly imprisoned for a baseless accusation of rape because he had rejected the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife. Genesis chapter 39 verse 7. It is only natural for a person who is unjustly accused and imprisoned to try to prove his innocence. However, Joseph was just a slave in a foreign land and had no power to do so. Consequently, Joseph endured his wretched state in prison for over 2 years, nearly 3 years. Genesis chapter 41 verse 1. Regarding Joseph's trial and suffering, the psalmist wrote, "They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons, until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him." Psalms 105-18. Severe affliction upon Joseph was part of God's administration to fulfill the covenant of the torch, which he had made with Abraham. The death of Isaac, Genesis chapter 35 verse 28, and the ascension of Joseph to second in command, Genesis chapter 41 verse 1, 1886 BC, 196th year of the covenant of the torch, Isaac's age at death 180, Jacob's age 120. Joseph's age 30, when he obeyed God's command for his father to offer him on the mountain in Moriah. Isaac became the model of obedience. After this, he spent his whole life achieving God's plan for salvation until he died at the age of 180 and returned to his ancestors. Genesis chapter 35 verse 28. Ishmael, who was 14 years older than Isaac, died 57 years before Isaac at the age of 137 in 1943 BC. Genesis chapter 25 verse 17. Joseph was 30 years old and was in Egypt when his grandfather, Isaac, died. While Joseph was in prison, he interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh, 2 officials. Genesis chapter 40 verse 1. As a result of this incident, he was invited to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, which ultimately led to his ascension as second in command in Egypt. Pharaoh's appointment of Joseph as second in command after hearing Joseph's interpretation of his dreams occurred immediately because God had worked to move Pharaoh's heart during this short period of time. Psalms 105-20. In Genesis chapter 41 verse 39, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are." Pharaoh had a conviction that Joseph's wisdom and intelligence came from God, not man, and thus he did not hesitate to appoint Joseph as his second in command. Joseph was about 6 years old when Jacob departed from Laban's house. He must have lived about 10 years in Succoth and Shechem with Jacob before he came to Hebron where Isaac was living. Since Joseph was sold to Egypt when he was about 17 years old, he spent about 1 year with his grandfather, Isaac. Genesis chapter 35 verse 27. During this short time, Isaac most likely concentrated on teaching young Joseph about the Word of God, which was originally given to Abraham, passed down to Isaac and then to Jacob. As a result, Joseph received dreams from God and became a man of great faith with a deep understanding of God's plan. Isaac's teachings in all likelihood greatly influenced Joseph.
This concludes today's message. Thank you very much. God bless you. I wish you have a good day.